The presentation I'm going to give is basically a little bit more towards the business side of the audience, basically, and part of the reason why I'm going to be bringing these other topics is because we at Vector, of course, we are a research institute. Our focus is modeling, but one of the things that we try to do, and I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail coming in the next few slides, but one of the things that we try to do is to foster AI adoption. And one of the things that we've seen as a common theme across many sponsors is that they don't necessarily even get stuck in the technicals, in a technical point. Quite often it's very difficult to even get to the point where the technical stuff is really relevant. What we've seen is that there are many instances where there is lack of awareness, both in the technical community and in the business community, of what basically what the other side does. So that is basically what I'm going to be focusing on, is to talk about what project management should look like for AI. Most of it is exactly the same. We're not reinventing the wheel here, but there are some key points that we've recognized that are typically become roadblocks when they are not properly managed. So we just thought it would be relevant to highlight those, right? So in terms of the presentation itself, what I'm going to start doing is talking. I'm just going to give a little bit of context in terms of who we are, what our projects look like, just so you get the gist of it. And of course, then it's a little bit of definitions. So I expect that everyone here understands what AI is, but I just want to be clear in terms of what is exactly that we are talking about, right? And then I'm going to go into more detail in terms of what are some of the key learnings that we've acquired through our projects. And basically, it's about machine learning, not really, not being enough to focus on the machine learning process when you look at it from a modeling standpoint, but you actually need to look at it from a bigger picture perspective. And then what are the type of conversations that are critical to be able to deliver machine learning solutions? And finally, what type of management styles are required for AI? That again may require to rethink some approaches. So I'll get into that in a second in more detail. So just to give you a little bit of context, and we were just hearing about Raquel and basically how she was part of the funding group at Vector. And the vision and the purpose of Vector is to drive research excellence and leadership in artificial intelligence, but it's not just kind of a separate statement. This is to actually foster economic growth and improve the lives of Canadians, right? So what we're talking about is pure research, plus the other side of how do we apply this, how do we make it have a real impact in the Canadian economy. As a result of that, we've been able to raise $135 million for the first 5 years, and what we've been hearing lately from the federal government and from sponsors and from pretty much everyone in the community is that they are interested in continuing this beyond this 5 horizon, right, for 5 years horizon. The other thing that I want to mention here is that we have 3 legs in our funding that is roughly divided in 3 thirds, right? So 1/3 is federal, the other 1/3 is provincial, and the other 1/3 is coming from industry sponsors, which are, well, the most significant contributors are some of the largest companies here in Canada, right? And then basically our core, as I said, is research. And by research, I'm talking about mathematics, computer science, and health. But it's a community of over 500 researchers. And then if we start counting all the master's programs that we also sponsor, we easily get to 1,500. There's over 1,000 people in registered programs that are recognized by Vector as AI programs. So in general, we have 4 main tasks. One is knowledge creation, which is, as I said, research. Then the talent pool expansion, that was, I would say, the critical reason why Vector was founded, which has to do with how do we ensure that there is enough talent that is residing here in Canada, in Ontario in particular, to actually deal with all the hiring needs from companies if we want this ecosystem to be able to deliver, right? And then we also have the topic of facilitating adoption. So you have the talent, you have the technical knowledge. Now the question is, how do you ensure that those pieces or those elements actually start delivering value in in the broader economical ecosystem. And it's in that point where I want to focus. So some of the things that we do is, or for example, my team is part of the industry innovation arm at Vector, where what we do is we develop applied AI projects, right? So that is my specific world. But in addition to that, we also have courses, and we also provide some exclusive recruitment opportunities to our partners. And the last of the pieces is we also want to contribute to identify and comprehend and solve AI social issues. These issues are not necessarily technical in nature, but definitely they are informed by the technical domain. So when you talk about things about fairness, what do we understand by fairness is not necessarily defined exclusively on the technical space, but definitely the technical space has an input to add to that discussion, right? And I'm just mentioning one, but as you know, there are many other social concerns around AI. So that is also part of our goal. Now, in terms of the specific projects, what we do with our projects is to provide I would say, a playroom for companies to try things that may be challenging in the sense that they don't know whether they're going to succeed. But what we bring to the table is the opportunity to bring the researchers that we have on our side to facilitate the delivery of those riskier projects. All our projects are what we call collaborative projects. That means that we are not really offering consulting services to the companies, but what we offer is the opportunity for multiple companies to work on a common problem and try to figure out the way to address that through technical means, right? And the other part of what we're trying to achieve with these projects is accelerate the learning curve. So it's different to just go and do a course or just play with it on your own than try to implement something end to end. So what we give them is the opportunity to do that and cross-pollinate in terms of ideas and best practices that different companies have, right? So just to give you also an idea in terms of the scope and size of our projects, they take about 4 months just to get started. Because we need to align all of these different sponsors that are different organizations, different goals, different stages of maturity, and so on. And they remain active for up to 14 months, right? So they are very long projects in general. We are trying to make them shorter and faster now, but at the beginning, it consistently they took a long time to actually get completed. And part of the rationale of the reason why it took so long to complete those projects has to do with these insights that I want to share today, right? And on average, these projects involve around 9 companies and 38 participants, right? So in general, they are fairly large, not just in terms of number of people that are involved, but mostly in terms of number of companies. It's not that common to have to deal with 9 different companies working to get something done, right? And finally, the last thing that I also wanted to add is that we have what we consider 4 types of projects. Some of those is what we call knowledge transfer, and in that space, you will see things like, for example, natural language processing or computer vision. You will see things that sound a little bit more like specific techniques or families of techniques. Then we also have what we call use case based, which are more focused on specific industry needs. So in that space, you see things like entity resolution. And then you have other projects that are more on the research space. And on those, we are actually trying to deliver something that is going to look like something new to the world, or at least new to all the participants, in the sense that we don't know where we're exactly going to be landing, but it's putting together this industry power with the researchers at Vector to actually deliver something new. And finally, we have what we call thought leadership projects, where we are tackling these issues that I mentioned before, like what should be the right approach for a certain industry, or what should be the right approach for a certain problem from a social perspective, and so on, right? So Finally, this is a very short slide. What I just want to add as context is when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we are talking about this very broad domain that has been around with us since the 50s. However, there is this one specific area, which is machine learning, that has also a lot of different context to it. And within this machine learning space, we are talking in particular about one area, which is deep learning, that has redefined how we understand other fields that are part of the traditional artificial intelligence domain, like computer vision, NLP, or, well, pretty much any domain right now is trying to be looked at with the lens of deep learning. So in general, when I'm talking about machine learning, I'm talking about, when I'm talking about AI, my bias is to talk about deep learning, but I'm also fully aware that depending on the audience, some people may be talking about different types of space, right? So going now into the insight piece, the very first thing that I want to highlight is that when you want to prepare your organization for machine learning, you need to go broader. Data and modeling on its own, it's not really enough, right? And this is one sample standard machine learning model in terms of how you start with a data set, you end with a model, and you have training data and so on. What we're trying to say is that all of that is in this little box, which is modeling. There are lots of things that need to happen before. So, for example, what happens with the data quality that you have? How are you preparing for that? How reliable is your supply of data going forward? Because it's not just about a moment in time. You will need to secure that data forevermore, and that includes quality. It includes, well, I don't want to go in detail, but this is a very long list of things that you need to do in the data space. And then there is a whole box on implementation that goes beyond, again, machine learning. Typically, this is leveraging your standard IT control environment. And there are some pieces in the implementation stage that may just not work for machine learning. So there are certain practices that are common practices in the DevOps world where you try to compartmentalize a lot of the applications just to simplify the end-to-end process. Where there are caveats that you need to be aware of. Of course, every practitioner knows these things. The problem is your IT control environment people may not be aware of all of these. And finally, we have production support. You may be great at creating these models. The question is, how good are you going to be 3 years down the line when these models are not sexy, not the new thing anymore, and actually just becomes routine maintenance? Typically, the team that you need to create, infrastructure that you need to create to deliver at that level is going to look different than the one that is creating the new and shiny toy with the latest technology. So all of these things need to be considered. But in addition to that, there is a management layer that is the one that is assigning resources and needs to prioritize the focus of the different teams. And all of these need to be in a governance space where you can actually deliver. You can ensure that you are being aligned with the organizational values and also with the sustainability model that you have, right? And remember that sustainability, I'm using it here in the broader sense of the word. So it's social sustainability, it's ecological, it's all the different things. It's not just about delivering results today. It's where is your organization going to be 10 years down the line. You don't want to be responsible for creating today something that is going to break your organization in 3 years, right? So all of those things, again, none of the elements in this framework that I'm sharing here is new to the world or anything like that. What I'm saying is when you're talking about machine learning, you need to be aware that you may need to do tweaks on each of these other pieces to ensure that your organizational machine learning capabilities are ready, right? So that was insight number one. Insight number two is you need to have a lot of stakeholders involved in any large-scale project. We are familiar with that. The problem is sometimes you will need to include some stakeholders that traditionally you don't include in your day-to-day conversations, right? So having that awareness is critical, right? And basically, I just broke this down into 4 big buckets. So one group is the machine learning related functions. I would expect everyone to be deeply aware of these ones. Anyone that is a practitioner in machine learning will definitely know what to include in this box. Then there is all the traditional technical functions that, again, are fairly usual. And then you have other business functions and control functions that actually may be more nuanced. So when you're talking about machine learning related functions, data scientists are the kind of baseline. But then, of course, you have the modeling piece, you have the engineering piece, you need data engineers, data architects. All of those may need to be included. So again, I would expect that any practitioner kind of anticipates this. And then again, when you go into traditional technical functions, all of the people that are in the classical IT world also are people that need to be brought to the table. From that perspective, you have software engineering teams, and that is, again, expected, I would say, and DevOps team also. The problem with this in particular is that they may look, or they may expect your machine learning model to comply with some standard practices that for machine learning may be particularly challenging. So these are conversations that should be started earlier rather than, I mean, sooner rather than later. And then you get into things like BCP. And we just had a pandemic. So any kind of modeling that you build with behavior pre-pandemic probably is going to be off in the first few months after the pandemic. So whenever there is a new legal framework, whenever there is a new thing that changes behavior, you may need to reconsider, okay, so what's going to happen with my model? And that means that you need to have a business continuity plan to decide, okay, so in these few months that it's going to take for me to look at or to get new data on the new behavior, what am I going to do, right? One option is I can accept my model to be wrong over those 2 months, or a few months, right? That is fine, but it's a decision. It's not something that happens because nobody thought of it, right? Alternatively, you can have your own models and you can just revert to your own models while you do this contingency. There are other things like data set shift techniques that allow you to very quickly try to shift from the original pattern that you had in your data set to new ones, right? All of those, I'm not saying that you should take one path or another. What I'm saying is these are important things that need to be considered. And what I've seen is that for many organizations, even though practitioners are fully aware, the organization as a whole may not be as aware as it needs to be. So these things may not be fully included for machine learning applications that are in production, right? Then in the next function, in the business functions box, definitely the relevant business lines, I would expect that everyone would include them, but you may have to include things like communications or public relationships. Why? Because you know that there is misconceptions on the general audience around what AI does. There may be misconceptions or actual real risk or challenges regarding privacy. There may be things that you want to address as an organization that you typically don't need to include. Similarly, operations or even human resources may need to be included in these conversations. So I'm not saying that there is one size fits all. What I'm saying is just be aware that even though typically you don't include these stakeholders in some of the projects, for this specific for deeply dependent machine learning projects, you may need to, right? And finally, the control functions, which are the funnier, I would say, of the lot. Part of the problem is by structure, these functions tend to be quite rigid because they are trying to enforce compliance with certain rules. And again, quite often, machine learning has challenges complying with those rules. Privacy, for example, may be a challenge. Fairness may be a challenge, and so on. So it's not black or white, but if typically you were used to including these guys, the control functions, towards the end of the project just to get their sign off, in this part of projects, I would recommend to include them from day one. Why? Because they may need to revisit their own processes just so they are ready for your project once it's ready, right? So overall, the message in all of this is I would expect that anyone that is a practitioner to be fully comfortable with the traditional challenges in machine learning, but don't expect your counterparts to be, right? And it may take several cycles for them to really fully be cognizant of what needs to be changed. So don't expect these things to flow easily, even if it is not your first AI project, right? So that is insight number 2. And now going into insight number 3, machine learning by its nature, especially at this moment in time, is more an art than a science. We still don't have a fully fledged theory on why this model learns, why a certain model in particular is going to learn from the topology of a problem. So in general, what we see is that these models are exploratory in nature, and that means that it may be difficult to predict what a specific iteration, what specific technique is going to work. So you need to be flexible regarding that. Definitely, it's iterative. I don't think anyone is proposing to deploy machine learning models through a waterfall kind of approach. But even within iterative approaches, the more flexible approaches typically tend to work better for things that are very innovative. For things where you are trying to do something that is already well understood in your organization, you may be perfectly fine just with more rigid approaches like Scrum or something like that. But as I'm saying, in general, there are many instances where I've heard feedback that people trying to apply Scrum to do heavily innovative projects have challenges because the time cycle or the whole methodology is trying to obtain incremental results. And when you're trying to do something that is truly revolutionary, I would say, chances are you're going to be moving in leaps, which is the last point. So overall, basically, the message on this is business in general, the business layer, for example, management or anyone that is assessing the performance of the project may have a hard time measuring the performance of these projects with the standard techniques that they use, right? So there's nothing wrong with the current techniques that they use, but they need to be flexible enough to recognize the challenges that are inherent to this technology and adapt accordingly. So right now you have organizations that have been fine-tuned to work with traditional IT methods, right? So that's what they do really well. So we can leverage those in the spaces where both technologies are aligned. But we all, I mean, anyone that has done any kind of coding in machine learning will be aware that the code that you're writing is quite different in nature than the code that is being written in other applications, right? So those are the pieces where we need to have that conversation and be prepared to have those conversations. So if you are a practitioner, basically you are good at machine learning, you know what you're doing. You need to be mindful that the people that you are talking with, they may not be as aware as you are of these topics. Conversely, if you are on the business side of this problem, just be prepared to encounter these challenges. So invite your practitioners to actually bring these topics forwards ahead of time, right?
What strategies and systems do Vector Institute have in place for your talent pool expansion? Like, how do you get people? Where are you getting them? And what are you doing with them, I guess, once you've got these people in your network?
Yeah, so as with most things that have to do with innovation, there is no one single answer, in the sense that we have multiple streams that actually all should be pointing towards the general talent pool expansion, right? So starting from the younger levels, we are encouraging people to take master's studies on computer science that include an AI component. So we have a program where we partner with universities around Ontario to look at what are the minimum set of contents that should be included in one of these programs to be recognized as a truly AI-related program. The second thing that we have in that space is we have scholarships, also aimed to encourage people to develop in this space. Then when we go one step further, if we go into the research, in the PhD space, we also have scholarships there. And the other thing that we are doing is we have this pool of very talented researchers that are working in universities, right? So there is a dual affiliation to a university plus Vector. And what we do is we give them a home, in the sense that, as you well know, it's very difficult for universities to compete in terms of retention capabilities, let's say, with talent. So what Vector does is they provide that extra financial support plus research capabilities plus freedom, so people can actually remain here in Canada, remain in academy or in the academic space, rather than go into the private sector, right? In addition to all of that, what we are also doing is we have, for example, a platform that is called Talent Hub, where we facilitate this market of talent and people seeking talent to find each other, right? So and the other piece that we also have in terms of the talent pool expansion, even within the companies, we also have these courses that we are also offering. We have the projects. All of those are ways to expand the talent in different spaces, right? So yeah, I would say those are the ones that come to mind.
Is Vector Institute involved with any project to reduce CO2 emissions using ML or COVID-related products? Great question.
Yes. So, yes. Okay, so for example, we did already an MBRL project, so a model-based reinforcement learning project, where we were trying to emulate or replicate what Google did on energy consumption on data centers, for example. So we've done things like that, where we're using, in particular, reinforcement learning to try to find ways to improve efficiency, to try to reduce emissions in particular. We're also working on projects around how to inform decision makers, for example, on COVID-related issues. But more in general, I think one of the focuses that we've been actively discussing lately is what we call the ESG kind of framework, where we're looking at environmental, social, and governance issues, right? And definitely we are looking actively at ways to expand on that space. And we've had multiple conversations with sponsors. The challenge in general in this space is that it's difficult for one organization, unless we're talking about things like reducing emissions in kind of a data center or things like that are very kind of, the scope is very well understood. It's difficult to get significant results for just one company. So another thing that we're doing, but I don't know if it's going to be applicable, for example, we're doing computer vision projects on satellite images to try to understand, for example, ecosystem deterioration or impact, that kind of things. But again, I don't know how applicable those are going to be off the bat. But it is an area where we are looking at opportunities to actually deploy and develop further, basically. I was just talking about from the project's perspective, right? From my team perspective. But in the broader Vector community, I'm fully aware that there is a lot of work being done, for example, in COVID. It's just that, again, 500 researchers, I don't know what everyone is doing. And I know that there is a big focus on those as well as in environmental topics, just not fully aware of what those are.
What is your prioritization logic to initiate a project? What are your project milestones?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. To be honest, I'm not sure how transferable these things are going to be. Remember that the nature of what we do is, as I mentioned, all our projects are collaborative in nature. That means that in order to launch a project, we require at least 3 industry sponsors to commit resources to that project. That means that it's very difficult to get something started. So we are very opportunistic in terms of how we do that, right? So we start talking with people when we identify something that at the same time is interesting for these sponsors, plus is interesting to our researchers, at least one researcher, plus it's feasible, right? So we have an idea of how to do this with machine learning techniques that are available today. We jump to the opportunity and we run with it, right? So we tend to look for projects in areas that are popular, for example, natural language processing, computer vision, and techniques that have been giving important results lately. But again, I wouldn't recommend that as the basic approach for anyone. And then in terms of milestones, again, our milestones have really very little to do with what industry would do, in the sense that our milestone is getting a project charter signed. Basically, we need the resources first. So once we have the commitment, then is when we call the project active, and then we have a series of milestones in terms of getting the environments ready, getting the people trained so they are capable to handling the techniques that they need to handle, having demos, having something that is a proof of concept that will illustrate what we're trying to achieve. And finally, I would say then we have basically the charter already completed, in the sense that we delivered all the things that we said we were going to deliver. And then it's what we call the distribution stage, where we try to make this available to a broader audience, right? So it can be publishing, it can be presenting in a conference, it can be, well, it can look in different ways. It all depends. We look at open sourcing code and so on.
Mm-hmm.